2,000 years ago, the ancient Mediterranean world was held firmly within the iron, unforgiving grasp of the mighty Roman Empire. From the glittering, marble-clad streets of Rome to the farthest, wildest edges of the known world, the word of Caesar was absolute law. The Roman legions were an unstoppable, highly disciplined war machine, bringing both unparalleled infrastructure and crushing subjugation to the nations they conquered. They enforced a period of relative stability known as the Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome. But this peace was maintained through brutal force, heavy taxation, and the constant threat of lethal retaliation against any who dared to defy the emperor. But in the dusty, sun-baked, and intensely rebellious province of Judea, an invisible storm was brewing. This was a land steeped in ancient fiery prophecies, a literal powder keg of political insurrection. The Jewish people, fiercely proud and fiercely monotheistic, desperately yearned for a divine deliverer, a Messiah to break their chains and restore the glory of King David's fallen throne. Into this volatile, hyper-political world walked a humble carpenter from the obscure northern village of Nazareth. His name was Jesus. To the Roman eye, he was a complete anomaly. He carried no physical sword. He commanded no earthly army. He held no political office, possessed no wealth, and associated with the lowest castes of society. Yet, within the span of just 3 short years of public ministry, his radical words and unexplainable deeds would ignite a spiritual movement that would ultimately bring the mighty Roman Empire to its knees. He did not preach a violent overthrow of Rome. Instead, he preached a revolution of the heart. He spoke of a kingdom of God that was not of this world, a kingdom where the first would be last and the last would be first. For a population living under the crushing weight of both Roman taxation and the strict, unforgiving legalism of their own religious leaders, his message of radical grace, divine forgiveness, and unconditional love was like water in a barren desert. But this massive wave of popularity was exactly what made him a target. As his crowds grew from the hundreds into the thousands, the establishment began to watch his every move. The political and religious leaders knew that in Judea, a charismatic leader with a massive following was only one step away from a full-blown revolution, a revolution that Rome would gladly extinguish with rivers of blood. The tension began to peak as the reports echoing from the rural countryside became impossible to ignore. These were not just rumors of an eloquent philosopher. These were documented, earth-shattering events that defied the laws of nature. Reports flooded into Jerusalem of the blind receiving their sight, the paralyzed standing to their feet and carrying their mats, and outcasts afflicted with leprosy being cleansed with a single touch. But the most terrifying, undeniable event, the true turning point that sealed his fate, occurred in a small, quiet town called Bethany, located just 2 miles outside the capital city. There, Jesus stood before a sealed stone tomb and called a dead man named Lazarus back to life after he had been in the grave for 4 days. This public, undeniable display of divine power was the final straw for the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. By the early spring of 33 AD, the ancient holy city of Jerusalem was overflowing beyond its capacity. Hundreds of thousands of devoted Jewish pilgrims from across the known world had gathered to celebrate the sacred Passover festival, a holiday that specifically commemorated their ancestors' liberation from slavery in Egypt. The atmosphere was electric, tense, and incredibly dangerous. The Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, was perpetually on edge during these festivals. He had moved from his luxurious coastal palace in Caesarea into the Antonia fortress overlooking the Jewish temple, bringing extra heavily armed legions to brutally crush any potential uprisings. And right at this highly explosive moment, Jesus of Nazareth headed straight for the city gates. He did not sneak in quietly. Fulfilling a centuries-old prophecy by Zechariah, he rode into the capital on the back of a donkey. The masses erupted in euphoric joy, stripping off their cloaks, waving palm branches, and shouting, "Hosanna," which translates to "Save us now." To the Roman sentries watching from the walls, it looked like the coronation of a rebel king. Immediately upon entering, Jesus marched directly into the sacred temple courtyard and violently overturned the tables of the corrupt money changers, boldly declaring war on the lucrative religious economy. The pieces were now firmly set on the board. The religious elite concluded that this man was a profound threat to their nation's survival. The final week had begun. The atmosphere in the upper room was incredibly heavy, thick with unspoken anxieties and the looming shadow of ancient prophecy. It was Thursday night, as the rest of Jerusalem joyously celebrated the traditional Passover feast. Jesus sat in deep seclusion with his 12 closest friends and disciples. In an era where social status was paramount and strictly observed, Jesus did the unthinkable. He removed his outer garments, wrapped a rough towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and knelt down to wash the filthy, dust-covered feet of his followers. It was the ultimate, scandalous act of humility, a job reserved strictly for the lowest Gentile servants. He was physically demonstrating the core of his message: true leadership is servanthood. He then took the unleavened bread, broke it, and shared the wine, establishing a new covenant in his blood. But beneath the surface of this sacred, profoundly intimate meal, a dark, poisonous current of betrayal was rapidly flowing. Jesus looked deeply into the eyes of the men who had given up everything to follow him for 3 years and uttered the devastating words that would completely shatter the peace of the night. "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The room erupted into confusion and sorrow, but one man remained guarded: Judas Iscariot. The motives of Judas have been debated by historians and theologians for centuries. Was he disillusioned that Jesus was not the militant conqueror he hoped for? Was it simple, blinding greed? Whatever the reason, for 30 pieces of silver, the exact biblical price of a common slave being gored to death by an ox, he had already made a calculated, treacherous deal with the high priests. Jesus looked at Judas and told him to do what he must do quickly. As Judas silently slipped out of the room, he disappeared into the suffocating, pitch-black darkness of the Jerusalem night. The contrast was stark. Inside, the light of the world was preparing to offer himself as a sacrifice. Outside, the forces of darkness were mobilizing their soldiers. Jesus led the remaining, deeply confused and sorrowful disciples out of the city gates, across the Kidron Valley, and began the slow, agonizing ascent toward a quiet, secluded olive grove on the Mount of Olives. The countdown to the cross was accelerating.
If you truly want to understand the profound depths of the humanity of Jesus Christ, you must look closely at the agony of Gethsemane. The word Gethsemane translates to oil press, a fitting name for the location where the Savior's soul would be crushed. Here, in the damp chill of the night, the unimaginable, crushing weight of the world's sins and the horrifying anticipation of the divine wrath to come pressed down upon him with lethal force. He stepped away from his disciples, falling face first onto the cold earth, and prayed with such ferocious intensity that historical and biblical accounts record a terrifying physical reaction. His psychological agony was so overwhelmingly intense that his sweat fell like great drops of blood to the ground. This is a documented, though extremely rare, medical condition known as hematodosis, which occurs only when the body is subjected to extreme, life-threatening psychological stress, causing the capillary blood vessels that feed the sweat glands to rupture. He was completely, utterly alone in his torment. His closest friends, exhausted by sorrow and a heavy meal, repeatedly fell asleep despite his pleas for them to keep watch. And then the silence of the garden was broken. In the distance, through the ancient gnarled olive trees, the flickering orange glow of torches began to pierce the suffocating darkness. The temple guards had arrived. They were heavily armed with swords, clubs, and lanterns, guided flawlessly through the night by the traitor Judas. In a moment of supreme tragic irony, a kiss, the universal, intimate symbol of brotherhood, respect, and affection, was weaponized as the ultimate signal of treachery. Judas approached his master and kissed him on the cheek. Chaos immediately erupted. Simon Peter, fiercely loyal but deeply misguided, drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest, severing his ear. But even in the midst of his own violent arrest, Jesus displayed absolute sovereignty. He commanded Peter to put away his sword, and reaching out, he miraculously healed the servant's ear. He then offered his hands to the guards. The disciples, overcome with terror, abandoned him and fled into the night. Jesus was arrested, bound tightly like a common dangerous criminal, and dragged aggressively through the winding cobblestone streets of the sleeping city to face his inquisitors. The tension began to peak as the reports echoing from the rural countryside became impossible to ignore. These were not just rumors of an eloquent philosopher. These were documented, earth-shattering events that defied the laws of nature. Reports flooded into Jerusalem of the blind receiving their sight, the paralyzed standing to their feet and carrying their mats, and outcasts afflicted with leprosy being cleansed with a single touch. But the most terrifying, undeniable event, the true turning point that sealed his fate, occurred in a small, quiet town called Bethany, located just 2 miles outside the capital city. There Jesus stood before a sealed stone tomb and called a dead man named Lazarus back to life after he had been in the grave for 4 days. This public, undeniable display of divine power was the final straw for the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court. By the early spring of 33 AD, the ancient holy city of Jerusalem was overflowing beyond its capacity. Hundreds of thousands of devoted Jewish pilgrims from across the known world had gathered to celebrate the sacred Passover festival, a holiday that specifically commemorated their ancestors' liberation from slavery in Egypt. The atmosphere was electric, tense, and incredibly dangerous.
The Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, was perpetually on edge during these festivals. He had moved from his luxurious coastal palace in Caesarea into the Antonia fortress overlooking the Jewish temple, bringing extra heavily armed legions to brutally crush any potential uprisings. And right at this highly explosive moment, Jesus of Nazareth headed straight for the city gates. He did not sneak in quietly. Fulfilling a centuries-old prophecy by Zechariah, he rode into the capital on the back of a donkey. The masses erupted in euphoric joy, stripping off their cloaks, waving palm branches, and shouting, "Hosanna," which translates to, "Save us now." To the Roman sentries watching from the walls, it looked like the coronation of a rebel king. Immediately upon entering, Jesus marched directly into the sacred temple courtyard and violently overturned the tables of the corrupt money changers, boldly declaring war on the lucrative religious economy. The pieces were now firmly set on the board. The religious elite concluded that this man was a profound threat to their nation's survival. The final week had begun. By the time a brutally beaten, bleeding Jesus was forced to carry the massive, rough, horizontal crossbeam of his own cross through the narrow, unforgiving streets of the Via Dolorosa, his physical body was completely failing. He collapsed repeatedly under the crushing weight, forcing the Roman guards to draft a bystander, Simon of Cyrene, to carry it the rest of the way. The final destination was a bleak, rocky, skull-shaped hill situated just outside the city walls, Golgotha. Crucifixion was not just a method of execution, it was a horrifying psychological weapon meticulously engineered by Rome to publicly humiliate, inflict the maximum amount of prolonged pain, and terrorize any who would dare defy the empire. Victims would agonize for days, slowly suffocating. Yet, even as heavy, rusted iron spikes were driven mercilessly through his wrists and his feet, the response of Jesus entirely defied all human logic. Looking down from the cross at the brutal soldiers gambling for his tunic and the religious leaders hurling insults at his agony, he uttered words of unimaginable, supernatural grace. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." For 3 agonizing hours, hanging suspended between heaven and earth, historical texts and ancient historians record that a strange, terrifying, and unnatural darkness fell completely over the entire land at midday. The weight of all human sin and suffering hung in the balance. And then, with a final earth-shattering cry of absolute victory rather than defeat, "It is finished," Jesus of Nazareth bowed his head and voluntarily gave up his spirit. A massive earthquake shook the foundation of the city, splitting solid rocks apart. Inside the sacred temple, the impossibly thick woven curtain separating the Holy of Holies was violently torn in two from top to bottom, signifying that direct access to God was now open to all humanity. The battle-hardened Roman centurion standing guard, a man who had presided over countless brutal deaths, looked up in absolute awe and declared, "Surely this was the Son of God." His lifeless body was hurriedly placed in a brand new solid rock tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea. The entrance was sealed with a colossal stone and guarded by elite Roman soldiers. The establishment breathed a sigh of relief. But 3 days later, on a quiet Sunday morning, the universe shifted. The elite guards fled in terror as an angel descended. The colossal stone was effortlessly rolled away, and the tomb was completely empty. That empty tomb sparked a roaring fire of hope that transformed terrified fishermen into fearless martyrs. 2,000 years later, the mighty Roman Empire is nothing but crumbling dust. But the message of the cross and the empty tomb lives on, stronger than ever, echoing with power and grace through eternity.